In less than 24 hours, Liz Truss will be sworn in as the new British Prime Minister. How will she handle major issues such as the flailing economy and the Ukraine-Russia conflict? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Liz Truss is poised to become the 56th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. She will replace Boris Johnson, who was forced to resign after a slew of scandals. Truss will inherit one of the worst economic crises the nation has ever seen, worsened by the pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine. The Bank of England expects inflation to jump to 13%, sending the costs of living and energy soaring. We begin with this report from CGTN's Naweed Jabakil.
UK Foreign Secretary for a year and now taking the top job. She held a steady lead over her centrist opponent Rishi Sunak in the national runoff to become Conservative Party leader, despite lacking initial support among her parliamentary colleagues. An illustration of how positions can change within this complicated, factional party. Truss focused her campaign on promises of immediate tax cuts across the board, corporate and personal, claiming it would spur economic growth, even as many economists challenge the approach. The economy will be the priority, with UK inflation in double figures and the cost of living crisis crippling household budgets.
Because one of the issues we are facing is a potential recession, and we know how difficult a recession can be for families up and down the country.
Fantastic.
Throughout the campaign, Truss gathered support as the established pro-Brexit candidate, channeling what many saw as a style similar to that of the most famous Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher.
And what we need to do now is deliver, deliver, deliver.
But on the global stage, her premiership faces serious challenges. She's vowed to remain Ukraine's #1 backer. Closer to home, a showdown with the EU is looming over Brexit, which she voted against. She's promised a tougher stance on dealing with Brussels over the Northern Ireland Protocol stalemate.
Now, I worked hard to get a resolution with the EU on this issue. It wasn't forthcoming, but I'm not somebody who's prepared to let the situation drift.
A popular message with her party, but it could risk legal battles and a trade war. She's also angered allies with off-the-cuff remarks.
President Macron, friend or foe?
The jury's out.
She's also pledged to get tougher with China's government and target firms like TikTok over national security concerns, comments the Chinese embassy has called, quote, irresponsible. This is the third time since 2016 Britain has a new leader. Brexit plagued Theresa May's premiership, while COVID-19 impaired Boris Johnson's. Liz Truss will have to address her own set of profound challenges, diplomatic and economic, if she's to avoid the fate of her predecessors. Naweed Jabakil, CGTN, London.
So, will Liz Truss be up to the challenge? To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from London, Jonathan Liss is a political commentator and journalist. From North Carolina, we're joined by Klaus Laris. He is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And also from the UK, we're joined by Wayne Fitzgerald. He is the leader of the Peterborough City Council and chairman of the Peterborough Conservative Association. Welcome to all of you to the show. Wayne Fitzgerald, let me start with you. And as I said in the introduction, Liz Truss will be facing a formidable array of challenges when she becomes Prime Minister. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal here in the United States which says Truss will be inheriting a United Kingdom economy which is on its knees. It is likely to be in recession soon, and inflation is at its highest rate in decades, with energy costs off the charts. The IMF says Russia will perform worse, will be the IMF says only Russia will perform worse than Britain among major economies. Given all that, is she up to the job?
Good to be back with you, Anand. Look, she is up to the job. We've got to get behind Liz Truss as our new Prime Minister, as a party, as a nation, and tackle what are global challenges. It's not just in the UK. So yes, we have an energy crisis. We have a cost of living crisis. It is not a good time in the world. But, you know, a lot of this is brought on by what's happening in Europe, and particularly within Russia. And I believe that the Conservative Party under Liz Truss will be the one to lead us through this crisis. You know very well that I've been a big Boris Johnson supporter, and many in the Conservative Party would rather that he was still here taking us through this. But we are where we are, and we need to move on in a positive manner in the UK, and Europe need to also get behind tackling this global crisis. And I believe we're best placed here in the UK to lead that charge.
Wayne, you say she has to get the country behind her, but is she talking about unity? I mean, there's even divisions within her own party.
Look, there's divisions in every party, you know, wherever you are in the electoral cycle. I think it's too early to tell right now. We're less than 12 hours from the announcement when Liz Truss became the leader of the party and will tomorrow to go see the Queen and take the country forward. It's too early, as I said, to say what will happen. I would think that Liz Truss will be listening to her advisors and colleagues about how we unite the party in terms of who is in the cabinet. And I hope that she takes a very broad approach and is inclusive. There's already talk of division, and I don't believe that is the case. I've no evidence to support that. But there are people that supported her through her campaign, and clearly along the lines of opposition, you know, whether you supported Rishi, who himself is a great politician. There are many talented people within the Conservative Party, and I'm sure she'll choose wisely going forwards.
Jonathan Liss, what do you make of the woman who's going to become the new British Prime Minister?
Not much, to be honest. I think that this premiership will be, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, describing something else, nasty, brutish and short. Liz Truss is inheriting, as you were saying, a dire economic crisis, in addition to various other crises, such as our relationship with the EU, which people don't talk about very much, obviously Ukraine, which will be slightly easier for her to handle, but above all, the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis. And she's shown remarkably little flexibility in her thinking. She's very ideological, very radical. And obviously she'll need to make very, very big decisions. She is coming into power with very little support comparatively from both the Conservative MPs and the Conservative membership, which means that her position is much weaker than it might have been, whereas Labour has a current lead in the polls ahead of anything that it's had in the last 9 years. So really, she is coming from behind, and there's no good news on the horizon. So it's hard to see how she's going to make up the ground, particularly when Boris Johnson has damaged the reputation of the party so much over the last 3 years.
Jonathan, you say she is very ideological, but she's had a few problems being consistent on policies, hasn't she? I mean, I was looking at some of the stuff. Well, actually, she started out as a liberal in her past and wanted to abolish the monarchy. She was against Brexit, then she supported it. And as one Liberal Party politician said, she plays to the gallery with whatever audience she is talking to. How much of a credibility problem does that give her?
It's interesting because on individual issues, I think that she obviously has changed policy, her mind on lots of things, and that's actually quite reasonable in a politician. I mean, I have different opinions now from what I had when I was 19, so I don't think anyone could hold that against her. What I think is interesting is that there is actually a remarkable consistency in some of the issues. Even when she was a Liberal Democrat, she seemed to be very much an economic liberal. I heard one anecdote that she was advocating the privatisation of lampposts when she was at university. So she's always been very, very individualistic, and that is a kind of legacy of Thatcherism, if you like. And that, in a way, can be dangerous as well, because Boris Johnson had no ideology at all. His only belief was in his own self-advancement, whereas Truss does seem to have this sort of quite dogmatic ideology, and that could mean that she's not as able to navigate all of these crises that are building on the horizon.
Klaus Laris, let's talk about her relationship with Europe? Well, we can talk about Brexit as well. There are still issues to be resolved, as we heard from our reporter in his report. What kind of relationship do you think she would have with Europe? I mean, we had one indication. She was asked about her opinion of the French President Emmanuel Macron recently, and she said the jury is out on whether he's friend or foe.
Yeah, if she was skillful and clever, she would try to have a good relationship with the Europeans, because she has so many domestic problems, the energy crisis, the inflation crisis, many other domestic crises, including a deep division in the Conservative Party, that it would be good for herself if she kept her back free and had good relations with the Europeans. But that doesn't seem to be the case, at least judging by her previous statements before becoming leader of the Conservative Party. She is very skeptical towards Europe. She wants to reopen the Northern Ireland question again. She wants to proceed with abandoning the protocol, the so-called protocol. And that is, an international law. That was agreed between the Johnson administration and the EU in 2020. And now the British want to go back on that and unravel that question, look at it again. And that is, of course, a breach of international law. And if she continues with doing so, which is very controversial in her own party, including in the House of Lords, then she will immediately on very bad relations with the entire EU membership. So I expect that she will perhaps tone that down once she becomes leader. But on the other hand, it is good to placate her right wing to actually pick a fight with the Europeans. So we have to see. The jury is still out, and the prime minister job is like no other job. She had a mediocre performance as foreign secretary and justice minister, but that doesn't mean to give her the credit that she also has to be a bad prime minister. So she can surpass her own performance in the past. We really have to see. The jury is still out.
Klaas, I get your point about the fact that it might make good sense for Liz Truss to have a good relationship with European leaders, given the problems that Britain faces right now. But isn't her first responsibility to her electorate, to her voters, to the British people who voted for Brexit?
This is true, but they did not vote for abandoning the protocol in Northern Ireland. Actually, when you go to Northern Ireland, the majority of the Northern Irish themselves voted in favor of staying in the EU. And it is an international treaty which the Johnson administration, a conservative government, concluded with the EU. Both sides signed it into international law. And when you have such a treaty, you cannot change your mind a year later and say, oops, I made a mistake. Let's unravel the whole thing. If you do that, you have the law of the jungle. International treaties are to be there to be relied upon. And Britain, of course, is very much a country of law and order and is famous for adhering to the law. And now to go back on that and simply give up that international treaty and question it, this is something unheard of in international law, and particularly for a country like the UK, which stands for law and order. It's one of the basic democracies in the world. And now to, for the new government to go back on that, that would be quite devastating, I believe.
Anton Fedyoshin, Liz Truss will be taking office with the Ukraine conflict still going on. Her predecessor, Boris Johnson, of course, he was a staunch supporter of Ukraine, providing weapons and other aid to the Ukrainians. Liz Truss herself, while she was foreign minister, held a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. It was a bit of a contentious meeting at the time. She appeared to be ill-prepared. She made a few verbal gaffes. But do you expect any major change in British policy towards Russia and towards Ukraine, and particularly the conflict, when she becomes prime minister?
And I'll answer your question in a second. I do want to register one thing as an historian here. Liz Truss is remarkably young for her position, and that does speak to her political and survival skills. 47 years old. Britain has certainly had very young prime ministers before. No one even closely approached William Pitt the Younger, who in 1783 became prime minister at 24 years old. But then again, that was middle age in the 18th century. So this is clearly a woman who knows what she's doing, but not in foreign policy, unfortunately, as what you mentioned demonstrated. I don't see any difference between Ms. Truss's premiership and that of Boris Johnson. First of all, she implemented the foreign policy that he sort of defined, and they worked hand in glove on the Ukraine crisis. Moscow, from everything that I've read, doesn't expect any changes and has really sort of more or less given up on expecting anything positive from London. But the real problem here is that Britain's domestic issues, as Europe's domestic issues, are now inextricably tied to Ukraine. You simply can no longer separate these things. Yes, the COVID pandemic left a very unfortunate and heavy economic and financial legacy, but the Ukraine conflict, and especially the sanctions that were slapped on to Russia with sort of maniacal glee and consistency, were not terribly well thought through. So the Ukraine issue is not only not a sideshow, it is one of the central issues going forward, domestically as well as internationally. I've heard nothing to suggest that Liz Truss will change anything, and the massive energy and therefore economic, financial, and inflationary crisis that all of Europe, Britain including, is going into this fall is a direct consequence of that. So we'll see what happens. The Russians at this point, it sounds like, are simply sitting back and waiting for nature to take its course, to quote a very famous British film from the 1960s.
Anton, as you point out, foreign policy, especially where it concerns the conflict in Ukraine, and domestic policy in Britain are now pretty much enmeshed, not just in Britain, of course, in the rest of Europe as well. So might that not inject a dose of realism into Liz Truss's foreign policy as far as the Ukraine conflict is concerned? I mean, she did, of course, implement the policy of Boris Johnson, but she's her own leader now. Might she perhaps be looking at ending this conflict?
I certainly hope so, but I seriously doubt it, Anna. And again, nothing during her campaign indicated this. Now, mind you, I think we all as adults know that what politicians say during campaigning and what they start implementing once in office are often quite different, sometimes diametrically different. I don't see that happening with Liz Truss, simply because Great Britain has already invested way too much in Ukraine to simply step back and begin to come to some kind of compromises with the Russians, which is what it's going to take to put an end to this crisis. Liz Truss hasn't really addressed the main concern yet, which is the energy crisis in Britain. Now, we're supposed to hear about a plan that it sounds from the media. She's had a team working on it. We haven't heard about it. Maybe tomorrow or more likely the day after we will. We'll see what happens. But if this plan is going to include subsidies and price caps, it's going to fail to address the fundamental issue that neither of those produces more energy. And to bring more energy to Europe, at least to bring the gas and the oil that are producing it, something will have to be done around Ukraine. Let's wait and see, but I'm not terribly optimistic.
All right, Wayne Fitzgerald, I'm going to talk about some of the domestic challenges she will be facing, but what are your thoughts on what we've been talking about as far as Ukraine is concerned?
It's a really difficult subject. So this country has a long tradition of sticking up for the underdog, and history will tell you that that's what happened in the last war. When we stood up to fascism in Europe and supported Poland and the Allies. So it's exactly the same now. Let's get it straight here. The Russians, not the people, the Russian government are bad people. They are murdering thousands of people. And the UK is front and center in defending freedom and democracy. If there is a way forward that the UK and its allies in Europe can get peace, then it's possible. But you cannot let the Russians and the Chinese and those people in the world dictate and basically murder people as what is happening. And it's evidence. I don't care what the Russians say, But we will support Ukraine, but also we will look to find a solution if we can, because that's the sensible thing to do. And I'm not going to kowtow to Putin as a resident, as a citizen here. And we should realize who is in the wrong, and we should get behind the Ukrainians in terms of globally.
Right. Wayne, I want to get to, well, this election that puts her at number 10 Downing Street. If we look at the vote that makes her the leader of the Conservative Party and then Prime Minister, she got 57% of the vote. It was not a big margin. Boris Johnson got more. Theresa May got even more. In fact, and most of the MPs in the Conservative Party voted for her rival, Rishi Sunak. I mean, does she have to contend with a divided party, and what will that mean for her policy platforms?
All I've heard today since the announcement was made at about 12:40 by Graham Brady, in terms of the internal politics, is that we all must come together and unite as a party behind the leader. In the coming days, we will find out how the cabinet unfolds, where people's allegiances lie. But so far, the indications are, in terms of the people on the ground, activists, Conservative members like me, and politicians, are saying we must come together, we must unite. I know Liz Truss, and I know what kind of person she is, and I think she'll be doing her very best to try and unite the party, unite the country, and get through the crisis, such as the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis.
Jonathan Liss, the next general election in Britain must take place at least by January of 2025. Do you expect Liz Truss to see out that entire term?
It's a hard question. If I had to put money on it, I would suspect that she might be forced out before then. I think that because there is already a sizable chunk of the Conservative backbenchers that don't want Truss, don't like her, there will be moves to oust her quite early on, particularly if she doesn't deliver on the cost of living crisis. So there could be, enough letters to the 1922 committee to force a vote of no confidence within, say, 6 months. It really depends on what happens over the winter. She might well succeed in defeating that vote if one were to take place. But there are so many odds against her. There are so many crises bubbling, and I just don't see that she's a skilled enough political operator to see her way through them. Obviously, she has political skills, because no one becomes prime minister without a degree of cunning, wile, and a political thinking, if you like. But in terms of the rigidity of her thinking, I just don't think that she has what it takes to get through. And she doesn't have the charisma, importantly, to appeal to the British people. And so when you see the polls now, that Labour is ahead, Truss may have a honeymoon period, but I don't see that lasting very long. And so Labour is still going to be ahead in the polls, and that will make Conservatives very nervous. And that is why I think that there's a good chance that she might be removed before the election.
Okay, Klaus Laris, there was opposition to Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister from another quarter as well. It came from the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, and this is what she said. Let's listen.
Liz Truss just becomes the latest Tory Prime Minister that people in Scotland haven't voted for. And had people in Scotland been given the opportunity over the last few weeks, they would not have voted for Liz Truss. And there is the democratic deficit laid bare again.
So, Klaus, is this going to be another problem for her, and possibly another Scottish independence referendum?
Absolutely. I mean, many commentators have said that the Conservative Party is scratching the barrel with Liz Truss, that she, is competent enough as a politician, but she's not prime ministerial quality. And I think many people like Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland agree with that. And a new referendum in Scotland has been on the cards for quite some time. The English approve that, the British Parliament needs, and the government needs to approve of that, and there will be a fight about But clearly, Truss is not the person to stave off such a referendum. The Scottish will insist on that, of course. And there's still also the Northern Ireland question with Sinn Féin, the largest party in Belfast. What will happen to Northern Ireland? Will there be Irish unity within a foreseeable period of time? I think the Northern Irish question and the Scottish question are deeply intertwined, and that may well happen in the future.
Anton Fedyashin, there are some in the United States media, the Washington Post for one, which are comparing the election of Liz Truss, or rather saying that this is the beginning of a new transatlantic alliance, very much in the mold of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Do you believe she will reinforce this relationship, this special relationship as it's called, or will we see a bit more of an independent United Kingdom?
Well, look, first of all, I think that this parallel Reagan-Thatcher, Biden-Truss doesn't work because Reagan and Thatcher were, of course, ideologically on the same page. They were birds of a feather, like we've rarely seen. You certainly cannot say that about the Democratic president here in Washington and the conservative prime minister in London. Now, they are clearly on the same page when it comes to the Ukraine issue, for example. They are on the same page when it comes to dealing with China, for example. They are on the same page with preserving the hegemony of the West, which incidentally, the very sanctions that both Washington and London have been so vociferously behind are at the same time eroding. So in that sense, yes, they are on the same page. But is this going to be a new turn in the famously, called special relationship? I don't believe so, because it's not like the special relationship had been broken before. Johnson worked quite well with Biden. God knows Blair was hand in glove with the Bush administration earlier, although he wasn't even a conservative. So no, I don't expect that there will be any major changes. I think things will go on as before. If anything, Britain, having left the EU, is now becoming more of a hostage to American influence rather than less. And as Britain charters this new era of a global Britain, of a great power, it will be very interesting to see exactly how independent it will become.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.